You'll learn over and over again that the narrative of queerness at Lafayette historically has been the narrative of silence. Where are the little nooks and crannies in an institution, because it's always been queer people at Lafayette, where have they found a place to breathe? Students are always teaching this college where it needs to be, and the effort is very often on their backs, and I think that has been the case very much with queer history in the last decade and a half, at least during my time. So I came to Lafayette in 2009, in the fall of 2009, and I interviewed for my job in the spring of 2009. So I was on campus for the first time in my life in the spring of 2009. I was having this very long, very intensive job interview. And the committee member who was touring me around campus took me to Farranon. We were walking around Farranon. And I said, you know, at some point I'd really like to see the Women's Center. I'd like to see the LGBTQ, you know, wherever the Rainbow Room is. And this silence fell. And then the person said, have I mentioned we have a really great gym, Kirby Gym? And I realized that there was literally nothing. The Queer Archives Project began in the early teens, around 2014. I was teaching a course called Sexuality Studies, and I was having students work with institutional histories and how they shape sexuality and sexual identity through cultural processes. And I got the idea that it would be really interesting to think about how Lafayette has shaped and been shaped by queer identities. And I wanted to work with the archives. But what started to happen is that we went to the archives and we realized that the archives has never collected materials on LGBTQ plus populations or histories at Lafayette, and the archivists were really excited to start doing that. So my students began to do research on the queer archives in the sense of trying to figure out, if you were going to look for queer history, where would you find it? If you have an institution that is powerfully homophobic and transphobic, it is anti-queer. Like it hunts down and tries to throw out queer people, right? So some of the oral histories talk about that in the Queer Archives Project. And the patterns that I've seen in the Queer Archives Project have been the arts and the humanities have consistently provided a place where queer people say things like, I would have never said the word, it was illegal when I was here. I didn't even know what the rainbow flag was. I didn't know what people were talking about. But I really loved the theater department. I would have died without the English department. I don't know what I would have done without the library. I think over and over again, queer history at Lafayette and more generally teaches us that the arts and the humanities help people survive. People will explain over and over again through the 70s and 80s into the 90s that aloneness is the story of being queer at Lafayette for a long, long time. So seeking community where you couldn't even say the word, or you would have been kicked out of school if it turned out that you were having some sort of relationship that was not heteronormative. The stakes were so high that community for a long, long time was impossible. So the concept of queer community as we would envision it now in a sort of 21st century sense is really, really modern. It's not really Lafayette's story historically, it's only a very modern story. So modern queer history is the history that looks like student groups like Quest or Out.
I feel like looking at like like, we came here, we got here, it was 2021, right after COVID, which during, like, the pandemic, a lot of clubs and a lot of community on campus kind of got taken away because people weren't physically here. So OUT was founded in 2021, which is the queer or the LGBTQ plus and ally club on campus. That there were previous forms of it, but that's something that had to be made again after the pandemic. So I think that we have a unique experience in that we came and we followed the community of Lafayette throughout the time after the pandemic, and I think that queer community has gotten stronger because we were starting from a place where community overall at Lafayette had gotten so, like, taken away, I guess. So in many ways I would say it's grown, but still has many ways in which it still needs to grow and has many more opportunities to grow.
When I joined, that was when they opened up the group to non-men, or like non-males. So that was really huge. And it was me and one other student who's a trans man. And it's been really cool. And I do remember that first evening of acapella, people were a little bit put off. This year though, it was fine. Since I've been president, there's been definitely a shift.
The Queer Archives project itself was envisioned as a digital project that would emerge from the stories of the people who had actually lived Lafayette's queer history. That we would base everything and create queer history from the queer perspective. In other words, it was trying to take a disadvantage. Here's a transphobic, homophobic college that had not paid attention or had actively silenced its queer history, and they were giving us a blank slate because they did that. The Worn Out Carpet is a concept put together by an Excel student of mine. Their name is Beck Stargell, and they graduated in 2020. And Beck put together a video essay having to do with an oral history by Riley Temple in the class of 1971. And Riley Temple's beautiful oral history talks about how in 1971, that means he would have also been the student here in the late 60s, there was no way that you could say anything about LGBTQ identities. And as he was searching and finding out his own identity, as so many queer students do during their college years, he found himself going to the library to read about quote-unquote homosexuality. And when he got to the shelf, he realized that the carpet in front of the series of books that had to do with sexuality and sexual identity was all worn thin with a big sort of pale spot on it. Even in college, he saw immediately, oh, everyone is coming here. There's actually a whole community of ghosts standing in this spot with me. And we're all coming here alone, but we're coming to the same place because the library is the magic spot that's going to promise us some help, some truth, some stories that belong to us, some way to find ourselves.
I remember it wasn't I don't know, they didn't make a big deal out of it. It was just the president at the time, Laura Betzer, she just thought it was a cool idea and had been talking to Tommy Lee. She was talking to Tommy Lee about it, and he was like, that's a good idea. I can help you guys with that. Which I thought it was cool because she's a cishet woman. She just was the president and was like, this feels like a cool idea because I know a lot of you guys are queer and I want people to feel accepted. It wasn't a big, I don't know, it wasn't a huge shift, I guess, outwardly, but I do think that it made people feel more accepted. It also made the arts houses just more identifiable, like as arts houses and as safe spaces.
I lived in Marquee my freshman year, which is an all female housing option, and whenever we had like community meetings or like floor meetings or whatever, and we would go around and introduce ourselves, everyone would have she, her pronouns, and I was the only one who had she, they pronouns, and like it didn't hit until the second community meeting where I was like, okay, wait, I am the only like quote unquote different person in my entire like floor, and that didn't process while I was trying to figure out like where to live on campus, because like I didn't care where I lived on campus until I got here. Because we started here from the beginning when Lavender Lane was first here, it was a lot easier just because we all came together in a common space of Lavender Lane. But even before that, like our freshman year, it was pretty easy to find community. I just joined a bunch of different clubs that like I was interested in, and that really helped, like the involvement fair and things like that. And like I just met people with common interests, and I mean, Jess and I became friends our freshman year, and like we're still friends. So it was pretty easy to like find my true friends in my community on campus.
And I feel like a lot of people outside of the LGBTQ plus community don't always think about gender when they are going through housing process, when they're living on campus. A lot of people just tend not to think about gender because it's not something they have to think about. So I feel like Lavender Lane and all of the gender inclusive housing options on campus are incredibly important, especially for those in the LGBTQ plus community who often feel like they have to choose like a gendered space, and when you're living in a gender inclusive community, you often don't have to think about that as much, and it's kind of just like a breath of fresh air. Like you just don't have to think about something that is often stressful for a lot of people, and it just gives people the opportunity to be roommates with someone, live on the same floor as someone, share a space with someone while not having to think about like gender. Yeah.
So when I came in 2009, there was nothing for queer people, but around 2010, 2011, the institution finally realized that they did need someone. I mean, this is like so behind times, it'd be comic if it wasn't sad. They need someone in campus life to talk about and talk with and help queer students. And so the new person who'd been hired to direct gender and sexuality programs, which was invented at that moment, was a gentleman named Gene Kelly. And he decided we just needed a big, splashy visual to just put it out there that we were going to talk about queer issues at Lafayette now. It was just ended up being an absolutely gorgeous visual. And in many ways, in terms of the college's queer history, it was a much safer moment than a lot of the edgier moments where there had been, you know, sort of really AIDS quilt coming as an edgier moment. Gay Fine by Me, megaphones, talking about rights was edgier than a really feel-good that looked really visually pleasing. I was in it in a red t-shirt. I was very proud to be part of it, but I also understood that it was a great photo op, and it had the downside of looking like things were fine. And so there's always that tension between, you know, it's sort of like the gay pride, I'm proud, but could you also not threaten me while we're talking about this kind of tension? And so it really broke things open though. And it was a great chance for a lot of allies to show how supportive they were, and they needed that chance too. So it's a more complex moment. There's a reason why it's up on Farrakhan. It's because it's pleasing, but it makes it no less important. So Gay Fine by Me is, for many people at Lafayette, the first sort of LGBT activist moment outside of sort of the AIDS quilt being here and starting conversations on campus. Gay Fine by Me took place in 2006, and a a first-year student named Dan Reynolds who was out in queer and no one would run Quest, this LGBTQ group. He said, I'll do it as a first year. And he decided this is a movement that actually started at Duke University, and he heard about it. And so he thought, we're going to do this at Lafayette. So he used student monies and he got the t-shirts together and the buttons, and he just sort of by hand with a few people decided that we were going to have a moment at Lafayette where people were going to stand up for the queer community. And they were worried that they would literally not give any t-shirts away because no one would want them. And of course, what happened always happens when you trust human beings to do the right thing and you really trust them. They gave them away in an hour. Everybody came to stand in front of Hogue Hall. They didn't have enough t-shirts, they didn't have enough buttons. Faculty picked them up. And they had a rally talking about, the need for safety, and that the bar was low at that point, right? Safety and acceptance and tolerance of just being queer on campus and walking around and being out. It was a real watershed because it was the moment that it was, but also because it showed that students and other people were ahead of the institution as usual. People were ready to talk about it. So it was a really brave moment. What's interesting is that the Lafayette newspaper refused to cover it. And so they had worked really hard to get coverage, and the newspaper just refused to print something. And so there's a wonderful story where they write up their own article and they hijacked all the newspapers and they put the article in the newspapers, and then they get in trouble because they've hijacked all the newspapers. So activism can be a little iffy sometimes, but it's a great moment for the college. It's a leap of faith that really I find the story quite inspiring. So it's a funny, it's a multiple story of what queer community looks like. But I think the college needs to do better asking questions and listening to the answers about what queer students need. If no one is proactive, there's no platform for queer students to talk about how it feels. And like any institution, there's every reason to be proud of progress. But literally, we are a liberal arts college. We should never be satisfied with progress. We should only be thinking about excellence. We should never be settling for less than. Every single person is thriving here. That has got to be our goal, not like, oh, we're not ranked #1 in homophobia anymore. I mean, we've got to challenge ourselves as faculty, as administrators, to set the bar higher and to help students help us, not expect them to do the work. And I think when there's breakthrough moments like Lavender Lane, for example, that should be cheered all day long. But we need to protect those kinds of spaces. Are they being proactively protected? I don't know, but somebody should have the answer to that. Like, that should be somebody's business to make sure that that is being protected. And also to ask bigger, smarter questions, because we're pretty smart here. So we should say things like, let's see, does every queer student live in Lavender Lane? No, that's impossible. So what would happen if we start to over-rely on Lavender Lane as the place where all the queer students are and they seem happier there? The assumption that they're happy there is an assumption. Putting that aside, there's a lot of queer students that don't live in Lavender Lane. What is their life like? And how do we make that better? Do they have classes where they feel like somebody says something homophobic or transphobic and it's let to slide? Do faculty let those things slide by? Are we training faculty to make sure we have queer-friendly classrooms? Are we making sure students come in here knowing that that's the community we expect? Like, not the community we want. Like, it's the one we expect. And that actually is a high bar, and it's our job to set that bar always higher. So I'm thrilled that if I came for an interview today, no one would say, oh gosh, we have a really nice gym, because there's, we've done better, but we can do even better, I think. Because when you talk about queer history is right now. Queer history is right now. And in 5 years or 10 years, people will look back and they will say, Lafayette got it right, or Lafayette really dropped the ball. So I hope we get it right.